Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I am today and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also recognize the traditional owners of where you all are joining from. I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in attendance today. Hello, everyone. My name is Sora Park. I'm the director of the News and Media Research Centre, and I'm also one of the authors of the report we are launching today, and I'll be chairing today's session. There's no doubt that local news has been serving as a venue for public discussion and debate and a mechanism for cohesion in communities across Australia. But local news media are facing an existential crisis, and gaps are emerging in the provision of local news, especially in regional areas. Today, we'll be sharing findings from 2 Australian Research Council funded projects, a linkage project, Heartbeat of Australia, tracking, understanding and engaging news audiences in partnership with Australian Community Media, and a Discovery Early Career Researcher Award, addressing the crisis of local visual news in regional and remote Australia. As you know, hundreds of local newspapers have closed in the past 5 years, and 5% of local government areas do not have any local news. We wanted to examine how audiences were feeling about this demise and what they were doing about it, and how news organizations can adapt to this changing environment. The insights we'll share today is from 6 different data sets on regional and remote audiences, a national online survey with about 7,000 people, content analysis of more than 6,000 visuals from more than 3,000 regional and remote news stories, a photo ranking exercise among regional audiences, a visual diary study, and a photo voice study, along with combined qualitative interviews with more than 200 regional and remote Australians. What we found from these studies is that many local news audiences are already deeply engaged in the production, distribution, and consumption of local news, and they were practicing engaged journalism, which is the topic of today. Engaged journalism can be defined as journalistic practices that build relationships between journalists and the public. And audiences' motivation to do so, in part, derives from their perception of a news gap in their local areas. So our study confirms a critical need for news outlets to adapt to audiences' shifting news habits and needs, and to place audiences at the center of local news ecosystem. And this includes finding new ways of reaching and engaging audiences, as well as new ways of producing and telling news stories. Co-author of the report and senior lecturer at RMIT and a DECRA fellow, Dr. TJ Thompson, will be presenting the first part, focusing mainly on audience engagement with visual news. After that, Dr. Jiyoung Lee, who is a senior lecturer at the News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra, will present the key findings from audiences' motivation and willingness to participate in local news production and consumption. After the presentations, we'll hear from Professor Christy Hess from Deakin University, who is Australia's top expert in local news sustainability, digital journalism, and rural communication. So now I'll hand over to TJ, who will share some of the key findings. Over to you, TJ.
Thank you for that overview, Sora. Great to be here with you all today and to chat about visual things, which are such an important part of the online ecosystem these days. So I will chat a bit about audience engagement with visual news, but before I do that, I'll start by kind of giving us a sense of what is on offer in terms of the content, visual content that audiences have to engage with. So there's a lot of different ways and forms that journalists and news outlets can present the news visually. They can use maps to tell people where things are happening. They can use charts, they can use videos, illustrations, photographs, computer-generated renderings, lots of different ways and forms of visuals that could be in journalist toolkits. But we see, at least for independently owned outlets, those that aren't part of a conglomerate or a chain, those are drawing primarily on photography as their kind of mostly only visual form that they're using when they're trying to tell the news visually. So with those outlets that are just independently owned, 98% of them are using photography alone to tell the news visually to their audiences. So there's not really a lot of diversity across visual forms, not really a lot of opportunity to use these different ways to tell stories visually compared to photography. But ownership does matter a bit. So for some of the larger organizations or organizations that were part of chains or conglomerates, we did see higher use of video, up to about a quarter for every kind of 4 stories, about one of the 4 stories being used with video. So ownership does matter, but also what matters is the uniqueness of the videos. If the videos were syndicated, they weren't locally produced, they weren't as engaging to audiences as if they were kind of homegrown, locally produced videos in those communities. So ownership matters, but also the uniqueness of the visuals matters quite a bit. We also, in our content analysis, looked at who or what was represented, how they were represented, who was missing, that kind of thing as well. And so you can see here an overview of some of the people-focused visuals that news outlets were drawing on. And again, a lot of different options here. You can focus just on people. You can focus on people with hopefully relevant objects, people with animals, people with the environment, people with objects in the environment or with animals in the environment. But we saw a lot of focus on those first 2 categories there. So 40% of the images in the sample were just kind of people only. So a lot of mug shots, a lot of just people's head and shoulders kind of shots, not really a lot of more storytelling images that showed people in context within their environments, either in the built environment or the natural environment. That was a lot more rare compared to just showing people's faces tight and kind of mugshot style. We also looked in terms of audience engagement at whether the images were seemingly candid or posed. So you can see at left there, a seemingly candid image, at right, a seemingly posed image. And the journalists and news outlets preferred to publish more posed images overall. More than half the images in the data set were posed. In terms of audience engagement, I would try to encourage folks to do a little bit more of the candid action style images like you can see on left there. From our interviews with audiences, they would say that they prefer the kind of more natural, candid images that show people immersed in what they're doing, kind of more action shots compared to the standard attention, just kind of frozen against a wall without a lot of background context being shown. So that's a little bit of a finding about audience engagement in terms of candid or posed images. We also, as Sora mentioned, did a photo ranking exercise with about 100 people in 3 different communities across Australia. And we looked at local news images that were published in their communities, asked them to rank them so we could get some quantitative sense of which images were more engaging, as well as some qualitative insights from follow-up interviews with them. And we saw that some categories of visual news were more engaging on average across the communities than others. So communities really looking out for the latest breaking news, what's happening in the community, whether it be bushfire or a disaster or crime news, that kind of thing. Health also quite universal, quite resonant, and community and other events also quite engaging for folks. But some categories were kind of less engaging on average. People seemed a bit burnt out over politicians, a little bit cynical about politicians, so those weren't as engaging visuals to look at for audience members. Neither were kind of club shots, so people kind of in local clubs, bowling clubs, shooting clubs, that kind of thing. Those weren't as engaging images on average. And we can kind of boil down audience engagement with visuals into at least, I think, 3 domains or 3 categories. So the attributes of the content itself. It contains things like the news values that are being drawn on, how timely or unique they are, if they're posed or unposed, the amount of color or lack of color in the images, exposure, the composition, if it's more simple or more busy. Audiences resonated more with simple compositions compared to busier compositions. So that's that first kind of bucket or domain there, the content of the image or visual itself. The second domain is the presentation elements, the surrounding context. So how big the visuals are presented, the size of the presentation, the captions and headlines. People oftentimes draw a lot on captions and headlines to make meaning and interpret visuals. So those are also quite important for engagement. And then finally, the last component is the attributes of the audience themselves. So we'd see a lot of this in the interviews where people would say, wow, someone got convicted of, murder in this courtroom today, and I walk by that courtroom every day on my way to work. And so that's a really important, familiar landscape in my local community, I'm finding that image more engaging because it shows something in my community that I can walk by and see and appreciate day to day. So kind of recognizing faces, recognizing buildings, recognizing places and sites around town, those also would help audience engagement most of the time. We also asked folks in the photo voice part of the project to identify for us, by taking photos on their own cameras, what sorts of stories do they perceive journalists aren't covering or aren't covering well. So they would take a photo in a local community showing us something they thought was kind of missing or covered poorly in their community. And the number one category of submissions was photos that represented some aspect of the environment. And again, I think that's interesting comparing that with the content analysis findings we talked about earlier, where we saw a lot of just kind of headshots and mugshots and not as many photos or visuals of people in their environments. So that kind of environmental aspect seems to be missing, both in terms of the content analysis and in terms of what people are wanting more of with their visuals. Also some focus and attention more on cost of living, culture and identity, and community events and services, according to what folks are seeing that's missing or not covered well in their communities, at least in the visual realm. And we'll just show you here an example of one of those photos that someone in one of these local communities in a regional area contributed and submitted to us for this research, with a little bit of a quote there accompanying this photo. Perhaps local media could be more like this art installation, show us something new, challenge our assumptions, help us see the world in a different way. Kind of a nice provocation to see the world a little bit differently, see something that you don't always see through your local news media's perspective. And I think with that, I will hand over to my colleague, Dr. Lee, for some news consumption trends. So over to you, G.
Thanks, CJ. So now I'm going to talk about the key news consumption trends that we found from our linkage project. So news has always been central to how communities and audiences make sense of the world. But the ways people consume it and the barriers they face are now shifting in important ways. So these trends reveal what matters most of the audiences. So the Heartland survey is an annual study about the news consumption and well-being among regional audiences in Australia. So this year, we asked over 7,000 people about what makes them feel connected to their local community. 3 factors really stand out. So here you can see 77% of the participants say shopping locally and supporting local business is important, followed by knowing what's going on in the community and accessing local news, information, and stories. Supporting local businesses is not just about the economics, it's about the relationships and identity. It helps people feel they are contributing to their communities. People want to stay informed about the local events, issues, and decisions that affect them and their families. Local news is not just about information, it's about the belonging. It provides the context that ties people into what's happening around them. When we look at why people consume local news, the top reasons are very clear. So the strongest driver, with 76%, is simply wanting to know what's going on in their local area. So close behind, the 75% say they want to understand things that might affect them directly. There is also strong interest in stories and information from their community and in gaining a better understanding of the issues they care about. Many also turn to local news for very practical reasons, so everyday updates like weather and traffic, or finding information for things like parenting and local schools. They also want to feel connected to their community through stories about their local area. The people rely on local news that is personally relevant, has a practical value, and also connects them to the community. When we asked people which news platforms they trust, so local newspapers came up on top. So with a 61% saying they trust local newspapers. So here we mean both print and online newspapers. So this was followed very closely by radio and television, with metro and national newspapers and 55%. These more established platforms remained the most trusted sources. However, trust drops off sharply when we look at the digital platforms. Only 38% say they trust news from search engines, and 28% trust in news on social media. Trust in AI chatbots is lowest of all at only 19%. While people are consuming news across multiple platforms, the highest levels of the trust are still attached to the traditional and local sources. It's not surprising that local news emerges as the most trusted platform, because people are mainly seeking news that feels close to their everyday lives. When we asked reasons why people trust local news, so the top reason participants gave, 68%, is that it's relevant to their local area. So the second reason at 46%, it's because local news organizations care about their community. Personal relevance also matters. 43% say they trust local news because it relates directly to them, and 2% say it's because journalists live in and understand their community. 1/3 of the participants also say that they can easily cross-check information as a factor that reinforced their trust. By contrast, the traditional drivers of the trust in national media, such as institutional reputation or journalistic standards, are far less important at the local level. Only 37% cited reputation, and just 21% pointed to high journalistic standards and quality. So this shows that what really drives trust in local news is its relevance to everyday life and its reflection of the community voices. While participants recognize the value of local news, they also highlighted concerns about its decline. In our qualitative interviews with 84 regional Australians, many reported a reduction in both the quantity and quality of the local news available in their area. So this sense of the loss was particularly strong in communities where local newspapers have recently closed. So one participant summed it up by saying, "We used to read the paper every single day, but we are just lost without our local paper." So these comments show that local news is not just a source of information, it's part of the fabric of the community life. But when it disappears, people feel disconnected and deprived of the important everyday information, from community events to milestones like births, deaths, and marriages. In addition to noticing a decline in the quantity and quality of the local coverage, participants also spoke about the uneven distribution of local news across the regions. So while larger towns may still have a weekly paper, many smaller towns no longer do. So as these participants explained, residents in those places often have to rely on papers from larger towns in the vicinity to stay informed. This highlights that local news deficits are shaped not just by a reduction in content, but by uneven access, with the smaller communities particularly disadvantaged. So audiences not only noticed in gap in local news, but also expressed dissatisfaction with how it is reported. They want news that is constructive, grounded, and with a local voice. This partially explains why audiences are not only consuming news, but in many cases are also participating in its productions and sharing. People feel a responsibility to step in and fill the gaps left in their communities. Leveraging this willingness to participate in the production of the news may be the key to how trust in local news can be rebuilt through audience engagement. In our interviews, we found that local audiences often play an active role in the production and circulation of the local news. From their stories, we identify 4 main types of contributions. The first is the information contributor. Local audiences often act as a valuable sources of news, drawing on their deep knowledge of their community and their willingness to share it. For instance, some participants describe themselves as being street smart about their local area and saw value in working together as a community to share that knowledge. So these views were particularly strong among people who had lived in the same community for a long time. The second is the trust builder. So these are active news consumers who filter information, fact check, and share condensed and reliable updates with others. They have to strengthen trust in local news by passing on accurate information. Participants explain that they often cross-check information from government or reliable sources before sharing it with their communities, emphasizing a sense of the responsibility when doing so. The third is a collaborator. Audiences did not see journalism as a one-way process. They were willing to take part in producing and shaping local news in partnership with the journalist. Some described local journalism as a puzzle that should include input not only from journalists, but also from organizations and community members, highlighting that their voices should be integrated into local reporting. And finally, the cultural connector. Participants from multicultural backgrounds often spoke about how others in their communities struggled with English and therefore relied on others to translate or explain the news. Many of the people we interviewed said they frequently translated or contextualized news for those with limited English, helping to bridge information gaps and ensure broader access. So together, these activities shows that audience is not just consumers, but co-creators of the local news, motivated by community ties and sense of the civic responsibility. In effect, regional Australians are practicing engaged journalism organically by trying to fill the news gap in their communities. So we defined engaged journalism as a set of the practices that prioritize meaningful interactions between journalists and audiences, as Sora mentioned earlier. So it actively involves community members in the news production process through collaborations, dialogue, and participation. While there are few studies in Australia about engaged journalism, there has been numerous trials and experiments in Europe and the US. So in a European study that examined more than 550 engaged journalism initiatives in Belgium, France, and Switzerland, they found that there is a range of the activities that are related to news production as well as those outside of newsrooms. So what we see is that engagement can take many different forms. So activities that are not directly related to newsmaking include things like marketing events such as contests or games, subscribe-only benefits like previews or discounts, fundraising drives, and social gatherings, and such as conferences or cultural and sporting events. So these initiatives are valuable for strengthening the relationship between audiences and news organizations, but they don't directly influence reporting. The second group of activities are directly related to newsmaking. So these are much more participatory and involve audiences in the journalistic process itself. So these include newsroom tours, open editorial meetings, and behind-the-scenes programs. These are great for transparency goals, which is so important for trust. There are also readers paneled surveys or voting on story priorities, which allows audiences to shape editorial decisions and direction. And in some cases, this extends further into upstream contributions, such as submitting ideas, producing user-generated content, or even co-producing stories alongside journalists. This example shows that engagement in a spectrum ranging from strengthening brand visibility and loyalty to fully involving audiences in the reporting processes. In the Australian context, this is still relatively new. The local outlets face questions about whether or how much these initiatives can be adopted in a sustainable way given limited resources. But the desire to participate is there among audiences. In our studies, we saw audiences already engage in a variety of ways of, from the contributing informations to actively collaborating with the journalists. So this was especially the case with the visual news contribution. These existing practices are invitations to open up new opportunities for building trust in local news and strengthening the relationship between news outlets and audiences. I will leave it there. I will hand over to Christy.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to thank Sora, TJ and G for the invitation to be here in Canberra today. We are all in Canberra together, just in separate rooms to make this easy. I'd actually first like to give a shout out to all the local journalists covering the manhunt in Victoria's Alpine region this week, because when the national media throng subsides, it's going to be the local journalists who have to help the community pick up the pieces and come to terms with what's happened. Can I say how refreshing it is to have two ARC projects focusing on local media, moulding together the way that that you have here? I think that's wonderful. I think that's a great collaborative effort, and there should be more of it. This is definitely the most current and largest study to capture the heartbeat of local news. But I also really want to take this opportunity to highlight that the backbone to this research field in Australia was established quite a long time ago. And so while I appreciate the opportunity to talk today, I do just want to acknowledge a handful of scholars who have really long highlighted some of the key findings that are coming out of this report today. So just to name a few, local news historian Rod Kirkpatrick, and notably Professor Ian Richards and Catherine Bode, they've talked about the business models, social capital, championing community and connecting audiences for decades. It's also wonderful to have part of this study dedicated to visuals in local news, as this has absolutely been a neglected area of scholarship in Australia. The Newsbeats ARC study that took place just a decade ago, involving Andrew Dodd, Matthew Ricketson, and Laurie Zion, among others, they highlighted the impact of the thousands of journalists made redundant during the digital onslaught. But the role and importance of visuals has really been under-examined. So well done, TJ. Both TJ and I have actually spent some time working in Alice Springs on separate projects, and there's a very talented photographer there who's just started working with a recently established newspaper, and his name is Phil. And he captures the most wonderful images of people in place in Alice. And if you walk the streets in Alice Springs and talk about the new newspaper, they will firstly highlight just how important the visuals are to, the way they represent the people and the places around in Central Australia. It's very heartening that this study reiterates that local news matters to people. And with the thousands of survey responses here, it's an amazing response rate. That's very impressive. One of the things that strikes me the most is that people want local news. They want more local news, and yet we have a local news crisis. So basic economics suggests that the sector should really be thriving if this were to come down to simple supply equals demand formula. But we know it's much more complicated than that. And I thought I'd highlight a couple of issues around that today. I know there's a lot of issues, but I'll just focus on two. The first issue is that local in itself is a very slippery concept, and it's a huge policy challenge. If you ask ACM, the ABC, Lena, Country Press, Nine, Southern Cross Austereo, Ace Radio, if they cover local news, they will all tell you they do, and they are very passionate about it. And right now, everybody has their hand up wanting a share of support and funding to help with local news, and that is proving very challenging for policymakers. So we get a sense from this study and other surveys like this that it's the place-based news serving towns and cities that people want more of. And they tell us that they're not getting it. Even if we look at Pidgey maps, which no longer exist, sadly, by the way, and it looks as though areas are very well served by news providers. So we actually need a reliable measurement tool that helps us to quickly assess and navigate that. And as a project team that I'm involved in, we're just experimenting with a tool to work out who really provides local news and who doesn't in a given town or city across the regions. I'm also aware that there's a lot of people from this sector in Canberra, over the last few months, lobbying their interests in this space right now. And I'm not naive to how the world works, but I actually think local audiences deserve an evidence-based approach to solve this crisis. And so do institutions and individuals who can help support the sector, like philanthropy or not-for-profits, just to ensure support is targeted, it's meaningful, and it's fair. It's great that the concept of engaged journalism is used throughout this report. But I think it also highlights a challenge for local news. So if we suggest that local news providers in Australia should be engaging with audiences, that's very much overstating the bleeding obvious to a sector which I think has a very proud and long history doing exactly this over time. So engaged journalism, it has many synergies with notions of advocacy journalism, community champion, constructive and solutions journalism. Local media, especially the press, they were exemplars of this in their heyday. But admittedly, this has sort of dropped off a steep cliff, especially when Mark Zuckerberg came along. Facebook especially became very much the new shiny thing, and that's where all conversation and connection started to be directed at the turn of the century, and that's been to local media's peril. So it's really good to see some examples, coming through in this report. And of course, we know that news producers can't do everything, especially when you're struggling to stay viable, and when key aspects of the ad revenue have shifted to big tech. So TJ's very right to point out this current gap, and the need to move forward is really where the priority needs to be now. I think the suggestion to increase contributed content is a really great way to encourage audience participation. And this has been actually quite a very successful model that's been implemented by news media for a long time, whether it be just, on a basic level, contributors giving sports results or Lions Club reports, and they're still very popular. We know that the ABC itself has experimented with contributed content through its ABC Open initiative some years ago. And so exploring learnings of that is worthwhile. The Community Newspaper Association of Victoria, that has more than 70 members, the papers are almost entirely dependent on contributed content and volunteer effort. But in saying that, I cannot emphasise enough how incredibly important it is to get the balance right, given that the emphasis here is also on ensuring the future of public interest journalism. Which, really does emphasise the production of original content and what many of us are all here fighting for. I think that community contributions can also be much broader. It was really great to see that slide, G, in terms of fundraising. For example, I'm thinking of, the paper, the Swan Hill Guardian, that just got together with healthcare providers to raise funds for an MRI machine, and they were successful in achieving that. and also that type of information that captures the cultural and social heart of community. So when I was a kid, the local newspaper had a colour-in page, and we were all rewarded with prizes. And if it was your birthday, you got an ice cream cake, and that was a great strategy. So well done, Sora, TJ and G, and the rest of the team. I'm looking forward to further discussion, but just before I do, I guess I'm hoping I can do a quick shameless promotion for an ARC project I'm working on and alluded to earlier, and I'm sure some of the members of the project team are here today. So it's working with the ABC and Griffith and looking at what the public broadcaster can do to support news deserts and vulnerable areas of the ecology by working where possible in a collaborative way with existing news producers right across the country. So we've just engaged a number of pilots to refine the blueprint we think will work after lots and lots of consultation. But Uni Canberra's latest digital news report of 2025 actually really has me thinking because, and even from the findings today, it highlights that local news and the ABC are two of the most trusted sources of news in Australia. So imagine the impact on information access and quality if they can all work together. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.